I came home to find a manila envelope on the kitchen counter and my wife's handwriting on the front. Sign and return. Inside were divorce papers, already filed, demanding half of everything I owned, the house, the investments, even the business I built before we met. She hadn't even waited for me to come home from my business trip. The envelope was her goodbye. My name is Ethan Cole, 42 years old. Founder of a logistics software company I started in my garage 10 years ago. I built it from nothing, coded every line, negotiated every contract. Last quarter alone, we cleared over $2 million in revenue. I'd always told my wife, Lauren, that we were in this together. But it turns out, she had a different definition of together. I didn't yell, didn't call, didn't even text her. I just sat there in the silence of our perfect suburban kitchen, reading the fine print. Her attorney's name, the court date already set, the list of shared marital assets. She wasn't just leaving. She was executing a plan. The irony? I already had one of my own. For the past 6 months, I'd been quietly gathering information. The late-night calls she took outside. The unexplained conferences. The credit card charges that didn't match her story. I'd noticed, logged, and verified every detail. But I hadn't confronted her, not yet. Because I wanted the truth in writing. And I got it. 3 weeks earlier, I'd hired a private investigator, an old college friend who now specialized in digital forensics. He'd found everything. The affair, the secret joint account in her name, and a man named Tyler Reed. Transfers totaling just over $120,000, all from our business account. She thought she was clever, funneling money through consulting fees. What she didn't know was that I'd been auditing every transaction since day one. When I saw the divorce papers, I knew she thought she was about to pull the trigger on me, take the money, the house, and play the victim. But what she didn't realize was that I'd already moved everything important out of reach. The company shares, the cash reserves, even the title to the house, all legally transferred under my lawyer's direction 2 months ago. Lauren thought she was about to destroy me. She had no idea she'd just walked into my trap. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, Mark Leland, the one man who knew everything. I didn't need to explain. I just said, it's time. By that night, Lauren's world was already starting to collapse, and she didn't even know it yet. Mark didn't ask questions. He just said he'd handle it. That was how we worked, quiet, efficient, surgical. While Lauren thought she was setting the stage for a clean exit, I'd already mapped out every move she could make. The next morning, before sunrise, I drove to the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see everything one last time before I made my play. From the outside, my company looked like any other tech startup success story. Open floor plan, espresso machine, motivational quotes on the wall. Inside, it was my life's work. My systems ran logistics for half the regional freight carriers in the Midwest. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, powerful, and quietly profitable. I'd built redundancy into everything: servers, backups, even ownership. A year ago, I'd moved my shares into a holding entity registered under my brother's name. On paper, I technically didn't own a thing. Lauren had no idea. She'd spent years posting photos of charity galas, weekend getaways, and couple goals captions. The perfect wife with the perfect life. But behind every curated post was calculation. When she realized my company had become worth real money, she started asking questions about ownership, shares, buyouts. Subtle things. At first, I thought it was curiosity. Then I saw the messages on her iPad. Messages she forgot to delete. That was when everything changed. She'd been planning this for months. Maybe longer. And she thought I'd never see it coming. When I called her that afternoon, she didn't answer. Instead, she texted, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer. It's nothing personal, Ethan. Nothing personal." As if gutting my life's work was just business. I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back a single word, "Understood." That night, Mark called. He'd reviewed the documents she filed, standard divorce playbook with a few interesting additions. She'd listed joint assets totaling $1.4 million, but her valuation of my company was nearly double what it actually was. She was trying to inflate the numbers to get a larger share. But Mark had already anticipated that. Every figure she'd used came from outdated public records, the ones I deliberately left visible. It was all part of the setup. The real numbers were buried deeper. hidden through restructuring, debt shielding, and silent partners who owed me favors. She thought she was taking half. In reality, she was walking away with nothing she could touch. And tomorrow, she'd start to realize just how far ahead I was. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No messages from Lauren, no calls from her lawyer. That was expected. I'd built a wall so high around my assets that it would take her team weeks just to realize how little she could actually claim. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even angry anymore. Just focused. This wasn't about revenge. It was about control, about not letting her rewrite my story. Mark had advised me to keep everything routine, predictable. Don't react, don't show emotion, don't tip your hand. I followed his advice. I went to the gym, answered work emails, and met clients like nothing had changed. But beneath that calm exterior, I was running quiet calculations. Every move she made was being tracked, every new filing mirrored, every document timestamped. That afternoon, my investigator sent me something unexpected, a voice memo. Lauren and her consultant, Tyler Reed, having lunch at a downtown restaurant. She was laughing, her voice sharp and confident. He was talking about next steps, about how once the divorce was settled, they could finally move forward. Then came the line that froze me. He'll never see it coming. He still thinks I'm the victim. I replayed it twice, then a third time, not out of pain, out of clarity. She wasn't just ending our marriage. She was performing. She'd built a narrative, the overworked husband, the neglected wife, the inevitable divorce. And she thought the court would buy it. What she didn't know was that Mark had already begun drafting our counter. Everything she'd done, the secret transfers, the undeclared account, the emotional manipulation, would soon become part of a timeline. A clean, precise, irrefutable story of fraud and premeditation. By evening, my phone buzzed. It was Mark again. He'd spoken with her lawyer. They were pushing for an emergency hearing, supposedly to protect marital assets. Translation: they'd realized something was missing. Mark's tone was calm, almost amused. He said they'd walk into court believing they were on offense. But by the time it was over, they'd be on defense. I ended the call and poured myself a drink. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Not victory, just calm, the kind that comes before the storm. Lauren thought she was about to win her freedom and my fortune. But the next move was mine, and it would be silent, deliberate, and final. 2 days later, the first court hearing was scheduled. A temporary order to freeze assets. Classic move. Her lawyer claimed I was attempting to hide funds. Mark had expected it. He told me to let them file, to give them the illusion of progress. The truth was, everything they were trying to freeze had already been moved out of reach weeks ago. On paper, I was barely solvent. A few accounts, some business liabilities, and a modest salary from my own company. Everything else lived inside layers of legal insulation they couldn't touch. When I entered the courthouse, Lauren was already there. Perfectly dressed, calm, with that practiced look of quiet concern she used when she wanted sympathy. She avoided eye contact, but I caught the faintest smile when her lawyer handed me a stack of documents. It wasn't the smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who still believed they were winning. Mark stayed composed, flipping through the pages like he was reviewing grocery lists. When the judge asked for comments, he spoke softly, deliberately. He said we had no objection to transparency, that we supported full financial disclosure, and that our team had already begun submitting updated records. It was the calm before a detonation. That night, I sent Mark the final package, proof of Lauren's financial manipulation. Wire transfers under her maiden name, invoices issued to a fake consulting firm, and emails showing she directed Tyler Reed to move funds offshore. Every message was timestamped, verified, admissible. I didn't sleep. I just waited. By morning, Mark had filed a formal motion for discovery, demanding Lauren's full banking records and communication logs. It wasn't retaliation. It was strategy. Once the court saw the pattern, her entire case would turn inside out. I didn't tell her, didn't call, didn't gloat. I simply went about my day, gym, office, meetings. Routine, controlled, unshakable. That evening, I checked my email. There was a single message from Lauren. You don't have to make this harder than it has to be. I stared at it for a while before deleting it. She still thought this was about negotiation. But what was coming next wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about exposure, quiet, methodical, irreversible exposure. And once the truth hit, no one in that courtroom would ever see her the same way again. The next week felt like waiting for a storm you could already smell in the air. Mark told me that Lauren's lawyer had gone silent. No emails, no filings, no responses. That meant only one thing. They'd realized they were walking into something they didn't understand. Still, I stayed quiet. No posts, no calls. Not even a reaction when mutual friends started texting me vague condolences, saying they'd heard about the split. Lauren was already crafting her narrative online, painting herself as the blindsided wife, abandoned by a cold, work-obsessed husband. I didn't take the bait. I knew that silence was my weapon. Every word she said now was being documented. Mark's paralegal was capturing screenshots of every public statement, every subtle attempt to sway opinion. Because once this went to court, character would matter as much as money. On Thursday, my investigator called. He'd found something unexpected. Lauren and Tyler had been using a cloud storage account tied to her company email. Inside were photos, travel receipts, and correspondence spanning nearly 2 years. Not just affair evidence, but financial collusion, contracts signed under Tyler's name, payments routed through his shell company. I didn't need to see the photos. The spreadsheets were enough. Mark reviewed everything and said one sentence that stuck with me. We're not defending anymore. We're prosecuting. That night, I drove past the house we used to share. Her car was in the driveway, lights on inside. For a moment, I almost stopped. Old instincts, I guess. The part of me that still remembered who we were before ambition and betrayal turned love into a chess match. But I didn't pull over. You can't save someone who mistakes control for affection. Back home, I opened my laptop and reviewed the timeline I'd built. Dates, bank transfers, and messages. Every line was a quiet reminder of how methodical this had become. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing. At exactly 9:15 the next morning, Mark filed the motion to compel. Attached were hundreds of pages of evidence. The hearing was set for the following week. Lauren had wanted a fight for control. What she was about to get was accountability. And she had no idea how much she'd already lost. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Neutral walls, quiet air, no emotion, just procedure. Lauren sat across the aisle, perfectly composed in a navy suit, her lawyer whispering into her ear like they were planning a presentation, not a confession. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said would come from Mark. When the judge entered, Mark stood and began calmly outlining the case. He didn't dramatize, didn't accuse, didn't even raise his voice. He simply laid down facts like stepping stones across a river. Date, transfer, account, signature. Then the connection. Lauren's consulting firm, the one she'd claimed handled marketing for my company, didn't exist. Its listed address was a storage unit registered under Tyler Reed. I watched as her confidence began to crack. The smile that had carried her through every manipulation started to tremble. Her lawyer tried to object, saying the materials were incomplete, but Mark was ready. He handed the clerk a sealed envelope, certified financial records subpoenaed directly from the bank. The kind that couldn't be faked, couldn't be explained away. The judge read for a long moment, then looked up and asked a single question: whether the transfers were made without my consent. Mark answered yes, supported by the notarized documents I'd signed months earlier restricting access to all corporate accounts. The same documents Lauren had apparently never read. For the first time, she turned to look at me, not with anger, but with realization. The kind that lands slow and heavy, like the sound of glass breaking in another room. The judge called a recess. Lauren walked out without looking back. I stayed seated, hands folded, breathing steady. Mark leaned toward me and said quietly, "She's rattled." That's the first crack. Outside, the reporters who sometimes covered high-value divorces were waiting. They didn't know much yet, just whispers about a dispute involving missing funds. I walked past them without a word. Silence was still my weapon. That evening, Mark called again. He said her lawyer had reached out privately, suggesting a settlement conversation. That was their way of saying they were scared. I told him no. There would be no settlements. No deals. No quiet walkaway. Not until every truth she'd buried was dragged into the light. By the next hearing, the story had shifted. The court wasn't looking at me as the husband hiding assets anymore. They were looking at Lauren as the wife who had lied to gain them. Mark called it a complete inversion of narrative. I called it justice, quiet, calculated, overdue. When she entered that morning, her energy was different. Gone was the confidence, the calm posture, the perfect performance. She looked like someone trying to hold a story together that was already falling apart. Her lawyer did most of the talking, trying to discredit the evidence, claiming misunderstandings, technicalities, emotional strain. But every argument unraveled the same way, by hard proof. Mark presented a new piece of evidence, the signed affidavit from the bank manager who'd verified her transfers. The account numbers matched the shell company. The shell company traced back to her and Tyler. The paper trail was airtight. The judge asked if we wanted to pursue criminal charges. Mark said we'd reserve that right, pending further findings. That line hit her harder than anything else. Because now, this wasn't just divorce, it was potential fraud. During recess, she approached me for the first time since the day she left. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, staring, as if trying to find the version of me she used to manipulate. When she finally said my name, it sounded fragile. I didn't answer. She said she never meant for it to go this far, that things got out of control. It wasn't an apology. It was damage control. Mark quietly stepped between us and ended the conversation. He reminded her lawyer that all further communication had to go through him. That was the rule now. When the day ended, we'd secured a temporary injunction. She was barred from touching any marital funds until the audit was complete. Mark told me this was the turning point. Her legal team would start falling apart soon. The fear of exposure does that to people. Driving home that night, I realized I didn't feel victorious, just detached. The version of me she'd known, the man who trusted too easily, who thought loyalty meant safety, was gone. I wasn't rebuilding yet. I was still dismantling. And the quietest part of the storm hadn't even arrived. A week later, Mark called with a tone I'd never heard from him before, satisfaction. He said they'd uncovered something new. Not through subpoenas, but through carelessness. Lauren had used her company laptop to access private emails with Tyler. IT logs proved it. And in one of those emails, she'd attached a scanned document, our prenup. She'd been sending it to a handwriting expert, asking if it was possible to recreate my signature. The message was clear enough. She wasn't just moving money. She was preparing to forge it. Mark told me we now had grounds for a criminal complaint. I said not yet. Let her think she still had control. Let her keep believing she could talk her way out. The longer she stayed comfortable, the more mistakes she'd make. That night, I received an email from her personal address. No subject line, just a few sentences. You've made your point. Let's end this quietly before we both lose everything. The irony almost made me laugh. Quiet was my language. But her version of quiet meant concealment. Mine meant conclusion. I didn't reply. Instead, I sent the message to Mark. He said we'd save it for court. It proved intent to negotiate outside legal channels, another strike against her credibility. A few days later, the judge ordered full forensic access to her devices. Her lawyer objected, called it invasive, unnecessary. But the judge didn't blink. Transparency was now mandatory. When they turned over her laptop, I knew the game was over. Within 48 hours, the forensic team found records of offshore transfers, small at first, then larger. Over $180,000 moved through intermediaries, ending in an account under Tyler's name in the Cayman Islands. That was the final thread. Mark prepared the disclosure summary, and I read it 3 times. Not out of disbelief, but to feel the weight of what she'd done. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd built a system around it. Calculated, documented, professional. When I told Mark I was ready to proceed, he said, "You understand what this means, right?" I nodded. Because now, it wasn't about divorce anymore. It was about exposure, consequences, and the kind of silence that ends everything. The final hearing wasn't supposed to happen that soon. But once the financial forensics came back, the judge fast-tracked the case. Mark called it a mercy kill. I just called it closure. When I arrived at the courthouse, I didn't feel nervous or angry. I felt detached, like I was watching a movie I'd already seen and knew exactly how it ended. Lauren sat at the far end of the table, her lawyer whispering frantically. Her face was pale, her movements small, the confidence long gone. Mark opened with quiet precision. He presented the timeline, the bank records, the offshore transfers. Then, the email about forging my signature. The courtroom stayed silent except for the sound of papers sliding across the table. Her lawyer tried to interrupt twice, but each objection was denied. When Mark finished, he didn't look at her. He simply said, "This is not a misunderstanding. This was intent." The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, then turned to Lauren's attorney. He asked if the defense wished to respond. There was a long pause, then a quiet, "No, Your Honor." For the first time since this started, Lauren spoke. She said she was sorry, that she didn't realize the consequences. But even her voice sounded rehearsed, stripped of sincerity. The judge didn't respond. He just began reading his ruling. The marriage was dissolved immediately. All of my business assets were deemed separate property. Lauren forfeited any claim to them. The court ordered restitution for funds she'd taken and referred the financial irregularities to the district attorney for review. Mark didn't celebrate. He just nodded once, closed his file, and said, "It's done." When the judge adjourned, Lauren didn't look up. She just sat there, staring at the documents that had once been her blueprint for victory. Now they were evidence of her downfall. Outside, the air felt cleaner, quieter. Mark walked beside me and asked if I wanted to press criminal charges. I said no. I didn't need to. The damage was already permanent. As I drove away, I realized something. I hadn't won by destroying her. I'd won by staying calm when she expected chaos, by moving in silence while she performed for the world. And by the time she understood that, it was far too late. The day after the verdict, I woke up before dawn. For the first time in months, there were no messages waiting, no new filings, no calls from Mark. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind that doesn't ask for attention or strategy. The kind that just exists. I brewed coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the same backyard where Lauren and I once hosted barbecues, laughed with friends, planned vacations. It all looked the same, but everything that had held it together was gone. What remained was cleaner, sharper, like the air after a storm. Mark called mid-morning. He said the district attorney had decided to move forward with the financial review. It wasn't up to me anymore, and I didn't care to interfere. He asked if I was sure about not pressing charges. I told him the same thing I'd told him in court. Some debts collect themselves. He understood. I went back to work that week. My team didn't ask questions, though they knew something had happened. The company was running smoother than ever. No distractions. No silent sabotage from someone who thought she owned half of it. Just focus. Lauren disappeared from social media. The woman who once lived for attention had vanished completely. Mutual friends said she'd sold her car, moved out of the city, maybe even changed her name. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to know. Some stories end quietly because they're supposed to. One evening, I found myself standing in my office, looking at the framed blueprint of my company's first design. Back then, I'd built systems that never failed, logical, structured, precise. I'd thought love worked the same way. It doesn't. Love needs honesty. Systems need control. And when you confuse the two, you build your own downfall. I locked the office, walked outside, and stood under the night sky. The same stars that had watched everything unfold now hung there, indifferent, distant. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger or loss. Just calm. I hadn't won by taking her down. I'd won by outlasting her, by refusing to fight on her terms, by staying quiet when she wanted noise. And in that silence, I found something she'd never understand. Freedom. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.